Hi, everybody. Jim Ostrowski, continuing the Free the Children tour. It started in New Hampshire. I was in Alabama the other day. I'm at the state capitol in Georgia today, and then I'll be in Tallahassee, Florida, Friday. After this trip, I'm going to hit three contiguous states next: Ohio, um, West Virginia, and Indiana. So, anybody in those states want to have me speak in your group, whatever, get in touch with me at libertymovement.org. All my contact information is out there. So I know it's kind of hot out here. It's a little loud. I couldn't get a good spot on the Capitol grounds because, frankly, there's the big security fence around everything. Not very hospitable. And there's a Liberty Plaza here, but ironically, there's a long list of things you can't do in Liberty Plaza. Apparently, nobody got that joke. Hopefully, the audience did. So what's going on here? So basically, I think the number one issue in the country is who's going to educate your children. Because if you're not going to educate your children, then some bureaucracy is going to take your kids away and put them in some big building that looks like a prison, and they're going to teach them whatever the bureaucracy wants them to know. Which, of course, they're going to teach them to love the bureaucracy, love the government, and that government is the solution of all our problems. Well, that's the ruling ideology of the country. If you look at my book, Progressivism, a Primer. So I talked about this issue. I've been talking about this issue for a very long time. I think in 1999, I wrote an article for the Mises Institute saying, look, the best political option in the liberty movement is homeschooling. And I'm not going to claim credit for the homeschooling movement, but I do claim credit for anticipating the homeschooling movement that's going on in this country. So much later on, I wrote a book called Government Schools Are Bad for Your Kids in 2009, and it goes through chapter by chapter, lays out the factual case against government schools, lays out the theoretical case, talks about what actually goes on in these places, which is usually very awful, talks about the fact that there's not that much difference in the what's called rates of delinquency in sorry about that noise. Rates of delinquency, rural, suburban, urban, all about the same. That's a big myth that the urban schools are bad, but the suburban schools are great. That's a complete myth. And as a criminal defense lawyer who represents people who go to these so-called suburban schools, I know that that's a myth from personal experience. The problem with government schools is, for reasons I explained in Progressivism, a Primer, people weren't ready for the message. It was just too radical, too soon, whatever. The joke is too soon. Yeah. Um, People were offended. Well, they went to government school and they turned out okay, and all that ego, malarkey, um, got in the way. But I think what happened is during the lockdown, we saw uh, the nature of these places as self-serving bureaucracies on display. They closed them down for no reason, and then when they opened them up, they forced the kids to wear masks. Um, many of the parents, for the first time, saw the blatant propaganda that goes on the various live streams, and we know about critical race theory, and that's discussed in my new book. But so I put out a new book called Free the Children, and just came up with sort of a new strategy, which is to focus on the red states. The blue states are really hopeless, except for the homeschooling movement, which is what we're working on in New York State. And we're going to be, we have a pretty interesting program to sort of help out the homeschoolers on a political level. But in the 23 red states, you hear the Republican Party talk about how we're against socialism and we're for parental choice, educational choice. Well, there's no educational choice in 23 states because of compulsory education laws. And in those 23 states, there's tax-supported, socialized schools run mostly by run mostly by Democratic union members. So what the book really does is sort of calls the bluff of the GOP to live up to its rhetoric, calls the bluff of Conservatism Inc., which is always talking about school choice. Actually, in some of these states that have allegedly have school choice, if you really drill down in the details, there's really not that many people using these programs, and it's kind of highly exaggerated. So I just want to talk a little bit about what's in the book. What we're trying to do is get a movement in each state, and I'm not going to run the movement. I'm from New York. I'm not going to get involved in local politics in Georgia and these other states, but I will help you out. I'll help you jumpstart it, and I have a background as a consultant. So, sorry for the noise. I couldn't find a quiet spot anywhere near the Capitol. This is it, with shade, and it's like 91 degrees out. So, just take you through the chapter titles, and maybe you could freeze frame that when you get a chance. So, the first chapter is this kind of a summary of government schools are bad for your kids, the book, and it talks about those problems I've already alluded to. There's a lot of crime, there's a lot of open sexual activity, there's a lot of drug activity, and I'm talking about in the schools, not just the students on their own time and property. The problem is getting worse over time. There's a school shooting epidemic. The prisonization of the schools is continuing. The propaganda, the critical race theory, which is basically teaching kids to hate one race and blame the one race for all their problems. And what's really pernicious about that is it's a form of scapegoating. I talk about this in a later chapter in the book. I wrote a little monograph about, what has caused the sort of stagnation in the black community since about 1965, after many years of progress, even after slavery. And it's not slavery, because there was progress after slavery that suddenly stopped around in 1965. So there was no slavery in 1965, and racism was worse before 1965. My point is that the real villain is progressive big government. But if the schools are teaching, no, it's critical race theory, it's white racism is the cause of all of your problems, the real tragedy there is that you're never going to find out what is the cause of your problems, which is progressive big government policies. So we talk about that. Chapter 3, the teachers are mostly agents of the Democratic Party. Chapter 4, your kids are being brainwashed, not educated. I think we can all agree on that. Chapter 5 is really important because I talk about why the schools can't be reformed. I don't understand. I understand why progressives believe that, government works, government can be reformed if it doesn't work. But why do conservatives think that this failed progressive institution of government schools can be reformed? I mean, are you a progressive? I mean, if you think this thing can work, this form of socialism based on bureaucracy and coercion and taxes, if you think it can work, how are you a conservative at all? I can't square that circle. Chapter 6, red state Americans should pull the plug on this failed experiment. That's a very short chapter. It's very obvious. Chapter 7, really 7 and 10 are the heart of the book. Because chapter 7 talks about the mechanics of dismantling the system. And there's like a step-by-step process that you would go through. And the first thing that has to be gotten rid of is the compulsory school laws, because that's what allows them to regulate all the private schools and the homeschooling, which would be the alternative for people who aren't super wealthy. The wealthy can always afford, elite private schools. But if we deregulate, then you let the free market experiment, and you could have all sorts of things, hybrid schools. I talked about this in the past. You could have a part-time school, and then you could homeschool the rest of the week, that kind of thing. But we can't do that with the regulations in place. So at a minimum, we have to get rid of the compulsory education law. I'm not going to debate that here, except to say that at any given time, 10% of the kids aren't in school anyway. So we don't have universal education now. It's failed. And a lot of the people who do show up are just basically physically there and causing a lot of discipline problems because they don't want to be there and harming the kids who do want to be there. So chapter 7 is the mechanics. Chapter 8 challenges the GOP to finally live up to its rhetoric. Chapter 9 challenges conservatives to finally conserve something. And then chapter 10 is sort of a political strategy in case the GOP does not get on board, which would not be a surprise because since 1913, when the GOP, not the GOP, since 1913, when progressivism came in, 1913-14, you have the 3 pillars of progressivism, plus war, which, as I explained in my book, is a progressive program in itself. The Fed, the income tax, and the war on drugs. And in the book, I have a chart of those major progressive programs and all the ones that have come subsequently, including the lockdown. And the Republican Party hasn't really challenged any of these things except the lockdown in a few states like Florida and Texas. So the national GOP has not gotten rid of a single major progressive program since the progressive era started around 1913. So that's basically it. What I'm looking at, the book's on Amazon, it's priced to sell. The website is libertymovement.org. All my contact info is in there. Again, I'm not going to start this movement in your state. You've got to do that on your own. What I'll do is I'll help you get it jump started with some consulting. And really the book is the consulting, but I'll certainly help in addition to that. I might come down and speak at a couple of events, but then you'll be basically on your own because I got 23 other states, and I'm working on homeschooling in the blue states because I think that's the only option, only viable option. So over and out from Atlanta, Georgia. I'll be at the Florida State Capitol at 3:00 Friday, a little earlier because people like to go home a little early. Hopefully, there's a quieter or shadier spot. I don't know. I've never been to Tallahassee, but we'll find out. But in any event, we'll get it done. I always deliver on my promises. Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching, everybody.